how does Donald Trump, because we're talking about the coming New World Order, which is another term for the coming one world system, and boy, this giveaway of the internet plays right. Most people they didn't even pay attention when the internet was given away. It was a huge story, huge story. How do you think Donald Trump fits into this?
That is a question that I'm asked quite frequently ever since the release of the film. And personally, I've heard a lot of Christians say that when he was elected, that he would get the country back on a more conservative path, or at the very least, delay the inevitable of the liberal agenda that's been on the fast track for the last decade. But we have to remember that God's plan, his sequence of prophetic fulfillment, is never, quote-unquote, delayed in his eyes. It's always the perfect timing. It always heads towards the conclusion that we know must be in prophetic fulfillment. And so Donald Trump, I do believe, is part of the entire prophetic sequence. And what we're seeing is quite frankly, a backlash of the trying to take back hold of the conservative effort, whereas the world is almost unifying against this type of thinking, this type of conservatism against Donald Trump, and in many ways, in the long run, could actually accelerate the liberal agenda as the pendulum swings way back over to the other side.
Yes, and I think that there's a major point made in this DVD, in this film, that I took away, and that is, and it's not particularly new, but I appreciated how it was inserted in and it tied your entire film together. And that is, there was going to be a happening, and it took place in 1948. It was the rebirth of the nation of Israel. And then we go to the verses. Let me go to one right offhand. Psalm 102:16, when the Lord builds up Zion, he shall appear in his glory. And a lot of verses, Brent Miller talk about, a couple of verses anyway, about the generation that sees this happen, the rebirth of Israel. That's going to be sort of the final generation. Your film comes right out and suggests that this is the last generation, correct?
Absolutely it does. And the reason why it seems to be so unprecedented, that the rebirth of Israel in 1948 is something that is statistically impossible. I don't think a lot of Christians really grasp how monumental it truly is. Because, first of all, you can't have a rebirth of a nation if it didn't collapse in the first place.
Right.
And the prophecies surrounding the rebirth of Israel precede the collapse in 70 A.D. And it's also an event that has never occurred in the history of mankind. We have never seen a time where people who have lost their land and integrated in cultures all over the world, which was common practice, especially during the time of the Roman Empire, to eliminate the quote-unquote enemy culture, to integrate them. We've never seen a people come back into their original land with a language and culture in the history of the world. So the fact that this was prophesied and happened in 1948, 1800 years after the collapse, in our generation, in this time where so many prophecies say that this is approaching the end of days, where even Christ said, look for these things that will be happening, where this is very, very close to the end, it can't be ignored.
Let me play a clip from your film again, and it's describing exactly what we're talking about, and how you cover this, I think, is just very, very excellent.
It was during Jesus' time in Jerusalem that his disciples came to him and asked about the end of the age. They knew that if he was who he truly claimed to be, the prophesied Messiah, then he could tell them exactly what was going to happen to the empires of the earth, including Israel itself. And according to the ancient records, Jesus answered them in shocking detail.
He has told us things that are going to take place at the end of days, at the end of this age. In fact, the disciples, when they asked Jesus about what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age, and he goes through and he starts to tell them all of these different things to look for.
And what Jesus foretold was not what they wanted to hear.
When Jesus was in Jerusalem, Jesus did not talk to the people about the empire growing, the nation ruling the world. In fact, one of the most frightening things that Jesus said to the Jews was not only that the destruction of the temple would happen, but that the Israeli nation would cease to exist. It would be scattered and destroyed.
Not only did Jesus provide details regarding the end of the world, speaking of concepts and global change taking place in the far future, but he also warned of events that would happen much sooner to the nation of Israel itself. He foretold of the complete destruction of Israel and the dispersal of the Jewish people to the four corners of the earth, a terrifying warning that most believed would surely never come to pass. But almost 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, in 70 AD, the prophecy was fulfilled exactly as he said it would be. The nation of Israel fell by an invading Roman army, led by the future Emperor Titus. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem, a massive structure over 40 acres in size, was completely destroyed so that no two stones laid upon another, just as Jesus foretold, and more than 1 million Jews were slaughtered during the siege of the city. The small surviving remnant of the Jewish people were dispersed to the four corners of the earth. The nation of Israel was so decimated by military force that for all practical purpose, the Jewish bloodline was considered virtually dead. But following the structural rules of the prophetic timeline, there was much more to this prophecy. Decades before the destruction of Israel came to pass, it was also foretold that long after Israel would fall in the future, through utter destruction and displacement, the people would later be regathered into the original land and the nation would be reborn. In fact, Jesus himself, who often spoke in parables, gave such an example through the imagery of a dead fig tree coming back to life at the beginning of the end of days.
Well, there's a prophecy that Jesus gave. He says, learn the parable of the fig tree.
And he talks about how this fig tree, when you see it begin to blossom, that will be the generation that sees his return. A very, very significant statement. Most Bible scholars believe that imagery in the parable of the fig tree is symbolic of Israel. So Jesus himself is saying, when you see that fig tree budding, coming back to life, know that my return is near.
So understanding that the fig tree that Jesus was talking about is in fact Israel. And they say when it comes back, then it will be the last days. It will be the days of Antichrist.
Prophecy foretells that the end of days would begin with the rebirth of Israel. But of course, this event could never happen if the nation and people were not decimated in the first place, presenting more compounding evidence as to the complexity of the ancient prophecies. But if this sequence of events wasn't miraculous enough on its own, additional prophetic details regarding how the rebirth would be fulfilled is something that would leave anyone speechless.
In Ezekiel 37, you have the Valley of the Dry Bones, this picture of all these bones of the Jewish people that have been scattered and separated, coming back together as a nation.
That was not just the miracle of the 20th century, the rebirth of Israel. I think it's one of the miracles of all time.